History remembers heroes in the moments before they die. Thermopylae gave us Leonidas and the 300, bronze, blood, and sacrifice immortalized in story and cinema. But the war didn't end there. It couldn't. Because after the last Spartan fell, after the smoke rose from the ruins of Athens, the Greeks didn't gain freedom, they gained rage. What happened next wasn't a tragedy, it was retribution. This is the story no one teaches. A real story, not myth. A year when Greece stopped begging for survival and started hunting for vengeance. A story where alliances crumble, democracy becomes a weapon, and the most powerful empire on earth discovers that starving a wounded nation only makes it more dangerous. This is the road to Plataea, where Greece stopped dying and started killing. The murder that ended negotiation. The year is 479 BC. An Athenian counselor named Lycidas rises inside a crowded assembly on the island of Salamis. Refugees fill the benches, soldiers, mothers, priests, and orphans who have seen their city burned to ash. Lycidas raises his hand and proposes something logical: perhaps we should listen to the Persian peace offer. Normally, that might spark debate. But Greece is done debating. The other counselors don't argue. They surround him, drag him across the floor, and stone him to death in the very place where democracy is supposed to protect dissent. The message is not political. It is primal. And it doesn't stop there. When the women of Athens hear what Lycidas suggested, they march to his house, seize his wife and children, and stone them in the street. No judge. No trial. No hesitation. Not because they are cruel by nature, but because they have nothing left to bargain with. Diplomacy has failed. Persia has burned Athens twice. The Greeks have buried sons, husbands, brothers. This is what trauma looks like in a world where survival demands savagery. How do you negotiate peace with a people who have already lost everything but their hate? Xerxes leaves, the real threat stays. The Persians had once marched into Greece like a tidal wave. Xerxes himself stood at the head of the greatest army the world had seen. But now, the king has gone home, leaving behind someone far more lethal than he was. General Mardonius. Xerxes is an emperor. Mardonius is a predator. While Xerxes loved spectacle, Mardonius understood strategy. He camps in Boeotia with a force that is smaller but sharper than the horde that crossed the Hellespont. No bloated parade units. No imperial tourists. Just killers, infantry, cavalry, archers, and veterans who broke the Spartan line at Thermopylae. To the Greeks, Xerxes was a natural disaster. Mardonius is the storm that chooses where to strike. Athens' breaking point. Athens is destroyed, again. Families live as refugees. Food is scarce. Architecture becomes ash. Hope becomes anger. The Athenians send messengers to Sparta, and they don't plead for help. They threaten. March now, or we join Persia. And if we join Persia, the walls of Sparta won't save you. This is geopolitics thousands of years before the term existed. Athens weaponizes the idea of defection, and Sparta finally wakes up. When Sparta moves, the earth answers. Sparta was never quick to react. It measured twice and killed once. But when it chooses to act, it acts at scale. In a single night, the Ephors mobilized the city. 5,000 full-time warriors, Spartiates, arm themselves. Then the detail that reveals their intent: they bring the helots. 7 for every Spartan. Not servants now, not baggage carriers, but armed auxiliaries. 35,000 enslaved men march to war under men who control every hour of their lives. Behind them, thousands more from across the Peloponnese join the column. Nearly 45,000 soldiers vanish from Sparta before dawn. Athens wakes expecting to scream at them. Instead, the Ephors point toward the horizon. You can stop shouting. The army is already at the border. But while Sparta marches north, Mardonius is already preparing the killing ground, and the Greeks are about to learn that the most dangerous traps are the ones built from patience. The Spartan march wasn't just a military response. It was a signal to the entire Greek world that negotiation was over. The Persians had offered peace terms. Athens had rejected them. Now the decision belonged to the battlefield. Mardonius reads the strategy correctly. When word reached Mardonius that Sparta had finally mobilized, he didn't panic. Persian scouts had been shadowing Greek movements for months, and the general understood something most Greeks did not: time was on Persia's side. Athens had no fields left to harvest. Refugees could not feed armies. Without a final decisive victory, Greece would starve long before the empire did. Mardonius intended to force that outcome. So he ordered Athens burned again, not for military gain, but for psychological warfare. It wasn't enough for the city to be destroyed. It needed to be uninhabitable. It needed to feel abandoned by the gods. To the Athenians, the message was clear: you have no home to return to until you kill me. Choosing the battlefield. But the Persians did not wait in Athens. That would have been strategically foolish. Greek hoplites fought best in cramped terrain. The narrow lanes and ruins of the city would neutralize cavalry and smother archers. So Mardonius moved north into Boeotia and fortified a massive encampment near Plataea, on the Aesopus River. The ground was flat, intentionally. Persian cavalry needed space to maneuver, and mounted archery was the strongest tactical advantage the empire possessed. This was not cowardice. It was the textbook doctrine of a professional army. If the Greeks wanted revenge, they would have to fight where Mardonius chose. The Greek alliance arrives. When the Greek coalition finally reached the foothills of Mount Scythian, they could see the Persian camp across the plain. Tens of thousands of horses grazed near the river. Armored infantry formed disciplined ranks. The immortals, decorated veterans of previous campaigns, stood beneath banners that glittered even at a distance. It was a reminder that Persia was not a mob of untrained slaves, as later propaganda would claim. It was a centralized military system built on logistics, pay, and engineering, things most Greek cities lacked. The Greek commanders assessed the terrain and refused to descend. It wasn't a matter of pride. On flat ground, the phalanx was vulnerable from every direction except the front. The Spartans had learned that lesson the hard way at Thermopylae. So they held the high ground and waited. From the outside, it looked cautious. From the inside, it was survival. The stalemate. Days passed. Heat collected in the dust. Corpse fires from the ruined city of Athens still smoldered to the south. Both armies understood that the war had entered a final phase. No one was negotiating. No one expected mercy. The Persians were frustrated first. Mardonius had not crossed the Hellespont to look at Spartans sitting on rocks. He ordered his cavalry forward, not to break the Greeks, but to test them. Mecistius enters the battlefield. The cavalry commander Mecistius rode at the head of his contingent, armored in scale and mounted on a Nicaean horse, animals bred for war and prized across the empire. The man was popular, respected, and visibly dominant in the saddle. In modern terms, he was the face of Persian morale. His riders harassed the Greek line, circling and firing arrows. Their goal was simple: force the Greeks to react prematurely. The tactic worked. The Megarians, stationed in a vulnerable section of the line, began to falter. Their messengers begged Pausanias for assistance. Without reinforcement, they would collapse and possibly trigger a chain reaction across the coalition. It's important to understand the political dimension here. The Greek army was not a single nation. It was a temporary alignment of cities with different laws, cultures, and rivalries. If a smaller city-state broke and fled, the alliance might fracture instantly. Pausanias sent help. Not Spartans this time, but Athenians, 300 hoplites supported by archers. Their counterattack was measured, disciplined, and effective. When Mecisteus' horse went down from a lucky shot, the Athenians swarmed him. His armor was so advanced that they struggled to kill him. They eventually found a weakness and drove a spear into the opening of his helmet. Mecisteus died in the dirt, surrounded by Athenians on foot. The loss was catastrophic for Persian morale. The Greeks paraded his body through the ranks, not out of disrespect, but because battlefield propaganda existed long before the term did. It reassured the coalition that the Persians could be hurt, and more importantly, killed. But military history is cruelly mathematical. Killing a charismatic cavalry commander did not win the war. What it did was accelerate the clock. Mardonius had been waiting for initiative, and now he had it. To defeat the Greeks, he wouldn't need more arrows, he needed to starve them. The battle was about to become a logistical noose, and the Greeks had no idea how tight it would be pulled. The death of Mecisteus was more than a tactical skirmish. It was the first moment since Xerxes left Greece that the allies felt the Persians could be wounded. But beneath the cheering and the morale surge, a quieter reality was unfolding. The Greek alliance had no plan for what came next. They had reached the edge of the plain and refused to descend, but refusing wasn't a strategy. It was a delay, and Mardonius was too experienced to mistake delay for strength. For days, both armies stared at each other across the fields of Boeotia. To men standing in the sun, waiting always feels like bravery. But to a general studying the maps in a tent, waiting is math. Greece had no grain here. The plains fed horses, not hoplites. Sparta had marched fast, but supply wagons lagged behind. Water sources were rationed. Dry bread went stale. Men drank wine that made them thirstier. Refugees from Athens who fled to the rear camps needed food as well. The Persians, by contrast, were sitting near a river with cavalry that could control the countryside. Water meant mobility. Horses meant logistics. And logistics wins wars long before swords clash. Pausanias understood this, but he had limited options. The Greek ranks were a patchwork of rival cities whose histories of mistrust stretched farther back than the war itself. Athens and Sparta cooperated only because Persia threatened them both. Corinth suspected Athenian ambition. The small city-states feared being used as bargaining chips. The coalition was brave, but it was not unified, and the longer they sat on the ridge, the clearer that became. Every night, campfires glowed along the slopes as captains bickered about policy, strategy, and honor. The Athenians favored aggression. They had lost the most and wanted to attack to reclaim dignity. The Spartans favored patience, believing discipline would force Persia to make the first mistake. Both were partially right, but wars rarely reward partial correctness. Mardonius was not idle. He used his cavalry like a hammer without swinging it. Messengers rode to Thebes and other cities suspected of Persian sympathies. Supplies flowed into his camp. Grain, wine, livestock, arrows, fodder for horses, enough to last. The Thebans, who had no desire to see Athens rise again, quietly celebrated the Greek stalemate. History often romanticizes Greece as if it were a single organism, but at Plataea the fractures were visible. Persia saw them clearly. Where Hollywood sees East versus West, Mardonius saw leverage. The Persians also understood morale as a military tool. Their camp was not quiet. It was wealthy. It was ordered. It was fed. Soldiers were paid by the empire, not led by farmers-turned-generals. Even the immortals, who lost their commander at Thermopylae, marched with armor polished and horses groomed. Mardonius intended the Greeks to look down from the mountain and see a machine waiting to be turned on. He wanted fear to replace hunger before hunger did the work for him. On the Greek side, the first cracks formed not on the battlefield, but at the water spring. The Gargaphia was the only reliable source available to tens of thousands of men. Soldiers filled jars, washed wounds, and soaked dried bread to make it edible. Disputes broke out in line. A Spartan elbowing a Megarian could become a diplomatic crisis. But the Persians knew about the spring as well. Scouts watched constantly. They mapped paths and measured distances. They calculated how long resupply took. And then they used that information the way a boa constrictor uses breath, not to crush immediately, but to tighten slowly. On the 8th day of the stalemate, the Persian cavalry rode not against the Greek line, but behind it, through the mountain passes. They seized the supply wagons traveling from the Peloponnese. 500 carts carrying flour, oil, cheese, and dried meat were captured or destroyed. The drivers were killed, and the oxen left to rot. The Greeks did not watch this happen, but they heard of it within hours. The news moved faster than fear. A line without supplies is not a force. It is a waiting disaster. Pausanias called the commanders to council. Athenians demanded movement. Corinthians suggested retreat. Spartans insisted on discipline. None of them could eat strategy. That night, fires burned lower. The next morning, the cavalry returned to the rear and began to harass the small streams and springs along the ridge. It was like cutting arteries instead of stabbing the heart. The Greeks could not descend to fight without trading the high ground for death by horsemen. But staying put meant dehydration. A soldier can survive on little food for days. Without water under the August sun of Boeotia, collapse comes faster. When the cavalry destroyed the Gargaphia spring, the equation changed. It happened fast, faster than most histories imply. Horses drank first, trampling the mud, turning clear water into slurry. Archers kept any Greek attempts to approach at bay. What had once been the lifeline of 100,000 men became a puddle unfit for animals. If Persia had sent infantry at that moment, the Greeks might have broken, but Mardonius held back. He was not chasing a charge. He was chasing a mutiny. By nightfall, men whispered. The Megarians blamed Spartans for inaction. The Spartans blamed Athenians for impatience. The smaller states blamed both. Pausanias listened and said little. Leadership is often measured not by action but by when action becomes unavoidable. On the 11th day, thirst made decisions that debate could not. Pausanias ordered a retreat, not a collapse, but a controlled repositioning to a location called the island, a patch of land with better water access and safer footing. This maneuver could only succeed by stealth. It required synchronization among cities that barely trusted each other. But there was no alternative. Staying meant mutiny. Moving meant danger. Retreating in daylight meant annihilation. Therefore, it would be done at night. The second watch was chosen. At midnight, shields were lifted, tents were struck, and lines began to move silently through rocky paths. Throats were dry. Armor chafed. Horses nickered in anxiety. Everyone knew that if Persia discovered the movement too early, cavalry could tear the army apart while it stretched across the slope like an uncoiled snake. In theory, it was logical. In practice, it was chaos. The center of the Greek line moved first and moved too fast. Corinth, Megara, and others withdrew not to the island, but all the way to the town of Plataea itself, clustering around the temple of Hera. No battle had been lost, no charge had been issued, but half the coalition had effectively removed itself from the coming fight out of confusion, fear, or perhaps self-preservation. In a coalition war, the line between those is often blurry. The Athenians, positioned on the left, waited for the Spartans. That was the agreement. But the Spartans were frozen in argument. Not collectively, but because of one man whose name survives 2.5 millennia later, Amampharitus. Commander of a distinguished Spartan unit, he refused to retreat on principle. To him, moving backward was dishonor, regardless of strategic necessity. Sparta was built on discipline, but discipline breeds stubbornness as easily as bravery. Amompharetus shouted, cursed, and insulted Pausanias, who tried to explain that this was not cowardice but repositioning. Words failed. Pride did not. Amompharetus lifted a heavy stone and slammed it at Pausanias' feet, symbolizing his vote not to retreat. Soldiers nearby watched in silence. Arguments like this in a Spartan camp were as strange as Persians sacrificing goats for omens. It meant doctrine itself was breaking under pressure. A coalition can absorb the panic of a small city-state. It cannot easily absorb a Spartan refusing his commander. Hours passed while Persians slept across the river, unaware their victory was walking into their hands. When dawn approached, Pausanias made the only decision he had left: he moved the Spartan main body without Amompharetus. The column descended the ridge, marching toward the island. Athenians observed from afar, unsure if they were witnessing strategy or collapse. Only when Amompharetus saw his fellow Spartans leaving him to face the Persian Empire alone did he order his men to follow. But by then, it was nearly dawn. And dawn does not keep secrets. In the Persian camp, sentries saw dust. They saw movement. They saw gaps. They did not see discipline. Mardonius was roused and informed. He looked toward the Greek lines and saw not a tactical maneuver but a rout, a broken army fleeing in disarray. For 11 days he had waited for this mistake. Now it was delivered to him for free. He did not form ranks. He did not design flanking movements. He ordered his cavalry to pursue. Behind them, infantry followed, shouting and beating shields to amplify terror. The Greeks heard hooves and horns before they saw warriors. Spartans were still forming when arrows came down. Thousands of riders swept across the plain, firing as they advanced, turning the hills into a killing field. Pausanias ordered a halt. Not a formation, a freeze. To charge meant exposing flanks. To flee meant destruction. So the Spartans knelt behind shields as arrows thudded against bronze and wicker. Priests were summoned for sacrifice, because in the Greek system the gods signed the order for battle, not the generals. Goat after goat fell, and each time the omens were wrong. Archers moved closer, horses pressed the wings, and the Tegean allies on the Spartan right threatened to break under the strain. Dying without fighting is unnatural for soldiers. Dying while your commanders wait for a deity's approval is intolerable. On the left, the Athenians found themselves not against Persians, but against Greek collaborators supporting the empire. Civil wars often hide inside foreign wars, and Plataea had both. Athenians fought hand-to-hand while looking across the field for Spartans who never came. Each city fought its own battle, and that reality contradicted every later myth about united Greece. Unity is a story told after victory, not before. Back on the right, when the final sacrifice finally yielded favorable signs, the Spartans rose as a single unit. No speeches, no trumpets, only the shift from endurance to violence. The phalanx advanced. The Persians had expected a chase, not a charge. The wicker shields protecting their archers shattered under the weight of bronze. Infantry scrambled to adapt. Persian swords cut into Greek shields and found nothing vital. Greek blades pierced linen armor and found flesh. Arrows that controlled distance became useless at arm's length. Amompharetus' unit, late to the field, crashed into Persian lines with the fury of men ashamed of their hesitation. Helots followed like an unacknowledged second army, killing wounded Persians and seizing equipment. The battlefield became a blur not of strategy but of survival. Mardonius rode through the chaos on a white stallion, rallying men, issuing orders, and refusing to retreat. A general on horseback among infantry was rare for Greek armies but standard for the empire. The symbolism mattered. As long as Mardonius remained visible, Persia still fought as Persia, not as a fleeing mob. But visibility cuts both ways. The Spartans saw him too. In armies without radios, killing the enemy commander could end battles faster than killing 1,000 ordinary men. The phalanx angled toward the white horse. Bodyguards died in heaps. The immortals fought hard, but the lineage of their name did not save them. When Mardonius finally fell, accounts differ whether by spear or stone, the sound of war changed. Persia, for all its strength, had always organized around leadership. Remove the head and the limbs lose purpose. Not all Persians collapsed. Artabazus, commanding a reserve force, assessed the field and made a decision both rational and treacherous. He withdrew with 40,000 men, not toward the camp but away from Greece entirely. His retreat transformed a possible regrouping into abandonment. What remained of the Persian army broke, ran, and sought refuge behind the wooden stockade they had built days earlier. The Greeks followed. Spartans circled the walls without a plan. Siege warfare was not their craft. They paced, cursed, and threw javelins that bounced off timber. When Athenians arrived from the left, exhausted and bloodied from their own engagements, they did what their ancestors had done against their own walls back home: they dismantled them. Wood splintered, and gaps widened. Through those gaps came the Spartans with the efficiency of a machine released from tension. What happened inside was not a battle. It was retribution. Persia had no space to maneuver. Horses were useless. Armor snagged on tents. Fires spread. Surrender was not accepted, because surrender was not part of the logic of the day. The Greeks had seen temples burned, children starved, and cities erased. What they did inside the camp was the arithmetic of rage multiplied by months of humiliation. When the killing ended, the Persians were gone not only from Plataea but from Europe. The cost to Persia was not merely military, it was demographic. An entire cohort of fighting-age men vanished in a single geographic grave. The Greeks walked among tents heavy with gold, silver, and luxury goods unimaginable in their own cities. They saw not just wealth but difference. The empire had lived a lifestyle incompatible with the austerity they believed defined strength. Pausanias entered the pavilion of Mardonius and observed its richness. The feast prepared for Persian nobles sat beside the Spartan black broth, and the comparison produced a lesson that would echo for centuries. The East, wealthy beyond imagination, had invaded the West to take what it lacked, not because it needed it, but because it could. And the West, poor by comparison, had beaten it because deprivation taught discipline. Yet victory did not end the story. It introduced consequences. Plataea secured survival, but it also empowered ambition. Athens would rise on the reputation of this day and turn the Delian League into an empire in all but name. Tribute would replace liberty. Gold would replace black broth. And Pausanias, who had mocked Persian luxury, would eventually be seduced by the very world he destroyed. He left Plataea a savior and returned to Sparta a liability. And while the field of battle had been cleared of Persian troops, Greece had not been cleared of Persian influence. Suspicion, politics, and wealth remained, and those three things often do more damage to nations than enemy soldiers ever could. At Plataea, the dust settled on a field that looked less like a battlefield and more like an excavation site. Every tent, every trench, every patch of dry grass carried bodies or the remnants of bodies. The Greeks had never seen anything like it. Even the most brutal intercity wars between polis rarely produced destruction on this scale. When hoplites killed hoplites, it was contained. It was personal. Plataea was industrial. It was the collision of empire and resistance, not neighbors. And because the victors walked among the spoils rather than fleeing from them, the psychological impact was inverted. The Greeks did not mourn. They took inventory. The Persian camp was not merely wealthy, it was organized wealth. Gold mixing bowls, silver vessels, carpets dyed with Tyrian purple, tapestries woven in patterns no farmer or shepherd from the Peloponnese could have imagined. The Spartan currency was iron bars designed to discourage saving. The Persian currency was minted gold that glittered under the Boeotian sun. Soldiers spoke in awe, in jealousy, in confusion. What enemy brings a palace to war? Only an empire that expects to win without compromise. And yet it lay gutted on the soil of a small Greek province that had no business hosting history of this magnitude. While the army processed its triumph, a different kind of news traveled across the Aegean. According to later accounts, on the very same afternoon that Mardonius died, the Greek fleet struck the Persian positions at Mycale in Asia Minor. There, too, the battle turned not into flight but fire. Persian ships were burned on beaches. Garrisons were overwhelmed. What survived Plataea's slaughter was consumed in a second blow hours away across the sea, as if the war itself wanted closure synchronized. The empire that entered Greece with tens of thousands of horses and ships now had neither. Xerxes, who once watched battles from a throne, would never again send armies west in such numbers. Victory, however, does not bring peace. It brings bargaining, reputation, and the recalibration of power among allies. Sparta, the land force, had won Plataea. Athens, the naval force, had won Salamis and Mycale. Both now claimed they had saved Greece, and both were partially correct. But salvation has a price, and the first payment is political capital. Athens, which weeks earlier was a city of refugees sleeping in Salamis, returned home not as victims but as victors. Their walls rose again. Their shipyards thrummed with purpose. Their fleet expanded beyond the needs of defense. And with victory came the creation of the Delian League. A coalition of island and coastal states expected to contribute ships or money to continue the war against Persia, even though Persia was no longer capable of invasion. Contribution turned to tribute. Tribute turned to coercion. In a few decades, the Delian League became the Athenian Empire in all but legal name. Gold flowed into the Acropolis. Sculptors carved marble. Philosophers debated. Democracy expanded. Tourists centuries later would call it the Golden Age, but standing at the origin reveals the irony: the Athenian Empire was built by refugees returning from a war they barely survived. Plataea did not only save Greece. It made empire safe for Greeks. Sparta watched uneasily. They had not gone to war for marble or philosophy. They had fought because the Persian invasion threatened their social order, the fragile balance between citizens and helots that defined their way of life. When that threat evaporated, Sparta withdrew from the league. Athens interpreted withdrawal as arrogance and ingratitude. The alliance that once fought shoulder to shoulder became a quiet rivalry. Plataea had ended one war and begun another, not against Persia but among Greeks. At the center of this transition stood Pausanias. His reputation after Plataea was unmatched. He had commanded the phalanx that killed Mardonius. He had orchestrated the night maneuver that nearly collapsed but ultimately allowed the victory. Songs were composed. Envoys sought his company. Greek cities offered honors. Sparta, famously allergic to praise, nonetheless tolerated his accolades because his fame served their interests abroad. Pausanias was sent east with a fleet to liberate remaining Greek cities under Persian control. He succeeded. He took Byzantium. He negotiated with satraps. But something shifted in the process. Contact with Persia did not merely expose him to luxury. It exposed him to another model of power, more centralized, more hierarchical, less constrained by the customs of a small agricultural city. Persia ruled through wealth and status, Sparta ruled through austerity and fear. Pausanias, who had tasted both, began to prefer the former. His cloak changed first, from coarse red wool to long robes dyed purple. His meals changed next. He banished the black broth and ate feasts prepared by cooks who had once served Persian officers. The greatest shift came last: he no longer wanted to command Spartan soldiers. He wanted to command Greek cities. The ephors back home heard rumors through traders and envoys. At first they ignored them. Victors often carry themselves too proudly in the months after war. But the rumors grew sharper. It was said that Pausanias had begun to speak Persian, that he kept foreign guards, that he dined on Persian couches instead of sitting at the common mess. None of these things were crimes individually, but collectively they suggested transformation. Sparta feared change more than Persia. Their entire society rested on the stability of tradition. A Spartan who embraced novelty was a threat regardless of loyalty. The next rumor was worse. It claimed that Pausanias had written to Xerxes offering to betray Greece in exchange for a political marriage. Few historians know whether the rumor was true or fabricated by his rivals, but for the ephors, the distinction did not matter. In states built on suspicion, perception is fact. Pausanias was recalled to Sparta for trial. He defended himself with the confidence of a man who believed his fame was a shield. He was acquitted. There was no hard evidence, and the court feared punishing the man who had saved them. But acquittal did not mean forgiveness. It meant containment. The ephors watched him now, quietly, patiently, the way Mardonius had once watched Spartans on the ridge. Pausanias did not adjust. He did not retreat into humility. He continued his contacts, his letters, his private counsels. He recruited helots with promises of freedom, a move so reckless it bordered on suicide. Helots were the foundation of the Spartan economy. To arm them, to politicize them, to promise them liberation if they fought against their masters was beyond disloyalty. It was revolutionary. If Persia had discovered such a man within its own ranks, it would have executed him instantly. Sparta chose investigation. A servant was instructed to hide and listen to Pausanias speaking to a foreign envoy. The plan succeeded. The servant emerged with the incriminating words still rattling in his memory. For Sparta, evidence finally matched suspicion. The ephors issued the order to apprehend him. Pausanias fled to the temple of Athena. Sanctuary was claimed. And here the tension between religion and politics revealed itself. A temple could protect a murderer from immediate execution, but could it protect a traitor who nearly endangered the state? Sparta chose a third path. They did not drag him out. They sealed the doors. Death by starvation is slow. It is neither honorable nor dramatic. It is erasure. Pausanias endured days until he collapsed inside the dark chamber. Only when he was moments from death did the ephors pull him into the sunlight so the temple itself would not become polluted by his corpse. In a city obsessed with ritual purity, even the final gesture served custom over sentiment. The man who had broken the Persian Empire died not on a battlefield but behind stones placed by his own mother. History prefers symmetry, but Plataea refused to provide it. The hero became a liability. The liberator became a cautionary tale. The victory that saved Greece corrupted the hand that delivered it. And while Sparta eliminated the man, they could not eliminate the consequences of the war he won. Athens continued to rise. Tribute continued to flow. The Delian League transformed day by day into an empire that would challenge Sparta's hegemony not through foreign invasion but through competition for prestige. Persia, ironically, remained a spectator to this development. The empire that had once threatened to absorb Greece watched as Greece fractured, enriched itself, and prepared for a future conflict entirely of its own making. Plataea had protected Greek independence but did not determine how Greeks would use it. Independence rarely produces unity. It produces ambition. And ambition, like empire, always seeks expansion. When the war against Persia ended, the Greek world did not return to what it had been. It could not. The invasion had taken cities, burned temples, turned citizens into refugees, and forced men who once argued in assemblies to fight shoulder to shoulder against a foreign empire. Victories create debts, and the question in 478 BC was simple but dangerous. Who would be repaid, and who would be left out of the ledger? Athens answered first. The city rebuilt its walls at a pace that shocked the rest of Greece. Spartan envoys argued that the walls should remain down, for the common safety of Greece, a phrase that concealed their real concern. A walled Athens was a secure Athens. A secure Athens could innovate, arm, trade, and dominate. The Athenians nodded politely and continued building. Stones climbed skyward, laborers hauled rubble, and the new walls enclosed a city no longer content to play second to Sparta's military primacy. The fleet was the key. Persia had shown that land power could be resisted by terrain, but sea power could shape the entire Aegean. Themistocles, who had argued for a navy before the war, now saw his vision become identity. The ships that saved Greece at Salamis became the infrastructure of a new political order. Islanders who once feared Persia now feared irrelevance if they failed to align with Athens. Levies were raised, ships or tribute, your choice. The smaller polis realized that tribute was easier than maintaining fleets. Once money replaced ships, dependence replaced alliance. Thus the Delian League was born, named for the sacred island where contributions were stored at first. But the treasury did not sit harmlessly on Delos for long. Within a few years, it was hauled to Athens, placed not under League oversight but in Athenian hands. The language of the League spoke of freedom, freedom from Persia, freedom for the Ionians, freedom for the islands. The reality was arithmetic. Tribute came yearly. Fleet construction never paused. The protections offered could not be declined. Sparta watched all this from the Peloponnese with a mixture of suspicion and incomprehension. They had won the great battle on land and expected influence to follow. Influence did follow, but not to them. Spartan power was static. It did not move across seas nor build walls nor mint coin. It maintained an army that defended a society built on agriculture and servitude. The Helots still worked the fields. The ephors still gave orders. But while Sparta stayed the same, Athens transformed. The states that joined the League believed at first that they were contributing to a shared effort to prevent future Persian aggression. But the war ended, and the tribute did not. When Naxos attempted to leave the League, Athens besieged it and forced it back in. When Thassos rebelled, the rebellion was crushed. The rhetoric of alliance turned into the reality of empire. Cities that had once sent oarsmen now sent silver. Silver funded architecture, festivals, and the arts. The Parthenon, standing centuries later as the symbol of classical Greece, was built with money originally collected to fight the great king. Sparta looked at this and saw corruption, not the moral kind, but the strategic kind. A polis that once slept under the threat of Persia now slept under the illusion of inevitability. Empires are built on inevitability. When tribute becomes expectation, when expectation becomes law, and when law is enforced not by persuasion but by ships, you have crossed the boundary between alliance and dominance. Yet Sparta hesitated. Their fear of uprising at home kept them from confronting Athens abroad. The Helots were not a background detail, they were the foundation upon which Spartan freedom rested. If Sparta marched its full force across seas to humble Athens, its slave population might revolt. And one successful Helot revolt would do what Xerxes could not, end the Spartan system. So the ephors watched the rise of Athens and told themselves that Greece remained free, even as League cities paid tribute like satrapies. Persia, ironically, adapted faster than Sparta. They began to negotiate with Greek cities indirectly. Diplomacy replaced invasion. Gold replaced armies. Coins traveled where cavalry could not. And in that flow of silver and darics, the political map of the Aegean shifted. Persia no longer sought to conquer Greece, it sought to balance it. If Sparta and Athens checked each other, the empire's borders remained secure without campaign. This was a lesson the West would learn much later, that regional stability can be achieved not through total victory but through endless equilibrium. Inside Athens, confidence bloomed into ideology. Democracy expanded its civic reach. The poor, who rode the triremes that gave Athens its power, gained a voice in government. Military necessity had democratized the city. In victory, the structure held. Generals debated policy in the assembly. Philosophers argued about the nature of justice. Tragedians wrote plays about hubris. But the irony of hubris was never lost on those who paid attention. A city that claimed to defend freedom now punished members of its alliance for attempting to exercise it. Sparta, by contrast, remained silent. Silence in politics can be interpreted as consent, but in this case, silence was paralysis. The Spartans did not understand maritime power. Their generals spoke the language of hoplite warfare. Their citizens trained for battles on land. Their society produced iron discipline but did not produce fleets. And fleets were now the currency of relevance. The years that followed Plataea therefore did not feel like peace. They felt like preparation for a war that had not yet been declared. The Greek world sensed it as a man senses an approaching storm through changes in pressure rather than through clouds. The Delian League tightened its grip. Sparta quietly formed the Peloponnesian League. City-states weighed allegiance not by ideology but by survival. Corinth, Megara, Aegina, each calculated where profit and danger aligned. Nothing in the landscape suggested Persia anymore. The new threat spoke Greek. History later called the coming conflict inevitable, but inevitability is only visible in hindsight. At the time, it felt incremental. A city refused tribute. Another built walls. Another sought arbitration. Dignitaries traveled between Sparta and Athens with proposals, warnings, threats. Each decision was small, but each nudged the balance further from equilibrium. The paradox of Plataea was that the victory that saved Greece from empire planted the seeds of a Greek empire. Athenian statesmen argued that the League protected liberty, and perhaps at first it did. But freedom must always be defined by who holds authority to enforce it. At sea, that authority belonged to Athens. At land, it belonged to Sparta. And when two authorities overlap without coordination, conflict is not an event, it is a process. The young men who fought at Plataea aged into veterans who watched alliances shift and wondered what they had purchased with blood. They had fought to keep Persepolis' shadow off their fields. They had not fought to see islanders pay tax to Athens or to watch helots whisper rumors of liberation. War changes states, but more importantly, states change because war changes expectations. The expectation after Plataea was no longer survival. It was primacy. Sparta understood primacy in a martial sense, to be first in courage, first in battle, first in sacrifice. Athens understood primacy in a political sense. To direct the affairs of others, to shape the sea lanes, to control tribute. The Peloponnesian War that would eventually consume the Greek world was not born from hatred. It was born from incompatible definitions of what it meant to lead. And all of it traced back to a plain in Boeotia where Persia died and Greece discovered it had the capacity not just to defend freedom but to wield power. Victories end battles, but they do not end consequences. Plataea crushed the Persians, but it had not answered the most dangerous question in the Greek world: who would decide what came next? The enemy beyond the sea was gone. The enemy across the mountains was still watching. And the cities that had once fought for survival were about to fight for influence. For a brief moment after Plataea, it seemed as though Greece had won the right to breathe. The ruins were rebuilt. Weary soldiers returned to farms and workshops. Festivals resumed. Philosophers spoke again in the agora. But beneath the surface, a shift was underway. The Persian invasion had forced unity, the Persian defeat removed the need for it. Without a common threat, unity became optional, and optional unity rarely survives ambition. Athens moved first, not with arrogance but with clarity. The Athenians understood that the fleet they had constructed for war could serve a second purpose in peace. Control of the sea routes meant control of commerce. Control of commerce meant influence, and influence meant the ability to shape the decisions of other polis. No formal decree stated this. No general proclaimed it. But merchants could feel it in the coinage, islanders could feel it in the tribute, and foreign envoys could feel it in negotiations. The Delian League had begun as a shield. It was becoming a lever. Sparta's response was silence, and silence is often misinterpreted. The Spartans were not ignorant of Athens' rise. They were cautious. They had defeated Persia on land by using the only system they trusted, discipline, hierarchy, and the hoplite phalanx. But the war had revealed that the sea had become a second battlefield, one Sparta did not know how to command. Navies required money, shipyards, timber, and trained oarsmen. Sparta had warriors, but warriors on ships did not make fleets. The Peloponnesian League remained a land alliance. Athens was building something maritime, economic, and ideological. Persia, watching from across the Aegean, made its own calculations. Xerxes' dreams of expansion were gone, but the empire did not collapse. Empires do not vanish when armies are defeated, they adapt. Diplomats were cheaper than cavalry. Coin was cheaper than supply lines. So Persia did the one thing Greece never expected, it became patient. Instead of sending soldiers, they sent money. Instead of building bridges, they built alliances. The great king understood what the Greeks did not yet see. A divided Greece was more useful than a conquered one. Meanwhile, the Delian League began to police the Aegean. They expelled Persian garrisons from Ionian cities, secured coastlines, and projected power deeper into Asia Minor. League members contributed willingly at first, seeing Athens as the guarantor of their autonomy. But autonomy enforced by tribute gradually became autonomy defined by compliance. When a city questioned the rate of payment, the Athenians reminded them that the fleet did not maintain itself. When a city expressed doubts, Athens reminded them that Persia still existed beyond the horizon. A threat does not have to be present to be useful, it only has to be remembered. The Spartans watched as Athenian influence crept north and east. To them, empire looked like a corruption of Greek values. To Athens, empire looked like the logical extension of victory. Both interpretations were sincere, and sincerity makes rivalry harder, not easier. The older men in the Spartan councils recalled the sacrifices at Plataea and believed Athens was betraying the purity of that struggle. The younger men in Athens, who had rowed in the triremes that defeated the Persian fleet, believed Sparta was ungrateful and backward. Neither side was wrong. Their truths were simply incompatible. The post-war decade produced incidents that seemed minor at the time but would later be seen as precursors to catastrophe. In one city, Athens mediated a dispute that Sparta believed should have been resolved locally. In another, Athens demanded tribute increases the islands claimed were never agreed upon. Corinth complained that Athenian commerce endangered its position as a trading hub. Megara sought to redefine its alliances. The map of loyalty was shifting, but not in ways the Congress at Plataea had intended. Every empire begins by claiming to defend the weak. Athens was no different. They argued that the League protected small polis from Persia. And it did, for a while. But when Persia stopped threatening, the League continued collecting. This is how empire emerges in the ancient world, not through conquest, but through the extension of protection beyond the lifespan of its necessity. Once tribute became normal, autonomy became risky. No city wished to decline payment and appear ungrateful. So the system persisted, funded by fear of a Persia that no longer sailed into Greek waters. In Sparta, debates grew more urgent. Some ephors proposed preemptive action, diplomacy first, then force if necessary. Others rejected confrontation, fearing that war with Athens would drain resources and invite the Helots to revolt. It was not the threat of Persia that restrained Sparta now, but the threat within their own walls. A city cannot fight external wars if its internal foundation is unstable. The Helot population always outnumbered Spartan citizens. That demographic mathematics shaped every military decision. A hoplite army sent overseas was a bet against revolution at home. Athens suffered no such constraint. Their population grew, their economy expanded, and their fleet recruited from the lower classes, giving political power to those who rode. The link between naval service and democracy was not ideological, it was transactional. If the poor defended the city, the poor gained a voice in how the city was run. And as their influence grew, so did the appetite for maritime power. A citizen who rows across the Aegean sees the world differently than a farmer who tends Spartan fields. Persia watched with interest as Greek politics came to resemble the Persian strategy of satrapies, influence maintained not by soldiers standing in city squares but by money and favors flowing through them. The empire did not need to invade Greece again. Greece was beginning to reshape itself into something Persia understood all too well, a system of competing powers that required arbitration and gold more than spears. What made the situation volatile was not hatred, but pride. Athens believed its rise was the reward for saving Greece. Sparta believed its restraint was the reason Greece had survived. Both narratives were accurate in part, and partial accuracy is the fuel of future wars. No commander had declared an enemy. No treaty had been violated. Yet the horizon was darkening. The Persian Wars had taught Greece how to unite. The post-war years would teach Greece how to fracture. And within that fracture, the memory of Plataea served two opposing functions. To Athens, it justified leadership. To Sparta, it justified caution. To the smaller states, it justified fear, because they understood that in the coming struggle, they would not decide the outcome. They would endure it. The years after Plataea reshaped the Greek world more profoundly than the battle itself. The Persian threat had been external, immense, and unmistakable. The new threat was internal and harder to identify. It was the disparity between what cities believed they had earned and what they believed they were owed. Athens expanded its influence not with declarations, but with routines. Tribute was collected annually. Fleets patrolled seasonally. Diplomatic missions traveled constantly. The League used Persia as its justification, but Persia no longer sent armies into the Aegean. They sent envoys instead, smooth-voiced men with offers of gold, alliances, and recognition. The empire had learned that it could lose battles and still shape outcomes. Strategists in Susa understood that if Greece fought itself, Persia would be safe indefinitely. Sparta felt the shift without having the means to counter it. They sent no fleets. They published no decrees. They relied on reputation and tradition, tools that lose value as generations change. The younger Athenians who grew up after Plataea did not remember the Spartan line kneeling under Persian arrows. They remembered ships at Mycale, tribute at Delos, and walls rising around their city. They believed that Athens had been the decisive force that saved Greece. In Sparta, old men insisted that the phalanx and the killing of Mardonius had been the turning point. To the young in Athens, that was ancient history. To the old in Sparta, that was identity. Corinth became the most vocal intermediary between the two. Corinthian traders watched Athenian ships dominate routes once shared. Ports that had once paid Corinthian merchants now paid Athenian collectors. Influence lost at sea became resentment on land. Megara, smaller and more vulnerable, navigated between alliances cautiously, aware that its position between Attica and the Peloponnese made it valuable and dangerous at the same time. The smaller cities took mental notes first, then policies second. Neutrality in such an environment was not diplomacy, it was delay. Athens, for its part, embraced the idea of cultural leadership as much as military leadership. The theater festivals grew grander. Public works expanded. Philosophers and sophists found patronage in the homes of wealthy citizens. When foreign dignitaries visited, they did not walk into a cluster of farms and stone houses, they entered a city that believed it was becoming a model for the future. Sparta did not understand such ambitions. They saw them as vanity. Athens saw them as destiny. Yet destiny has a cost. To maintain the fleet, Athens needed tribute. To maintain tribute, it needed compliance. Compliance required force, even if that force was rarely exercised. When Thassos rebelled, the siege was long and bitter. When other islands hesitated, the League responded before hesitation could become resistance. The Athenians were not cruel, they were consistent. An empire that tolerates exceptions soon loses authority. At the same time, Sparta's world remained fixed in its ancient constraints. The Helots remained the foundation of the state, and the fear of revolt remained the unspoken axis of Spartan policy. Victories at Plataea and Mycale had saved Greece, but they had not changed the mathematics of Spartan society. That mathematics dictated what Sparta could and could not do in foreign affairs. A city whose stability depends on controlling a majority population cannot afford adventures that leave its homeland exposed. The Helots watched all of this with eyes sharpened by opportunity. They had marched with the Spartans at Plataea, fought under Spartan command, and seen the Persian camp torn apart by men who once disciplined them. They had watched Pausanias, the hero of Plataea, promise freedom as he drifted toward Persian customs. They understood that war had not only shaken the Greek world, it had shaken the terms of their subordination. Revolutions are born not from ideology but from possibility, and possibility had entered their calculations. Sparta sensed the danger. Internal reforms were proposed, rejected, reconsidered, delayed. None solved the problem, because the problem was not structural, it was chronological. Athens was moving forward into a new mode of political existence. Sparta was attempting to hold time still. History tends to favor motion over stasis. Meanwhile, Persia quietly improved its position. The empire reinforced its western satrapies, rebuilt garrisons in Asia Minor, and applied pressure through diplomacy rather than invasion. Persian strategy was now subtle. If Athens dominated the sea, and Sparta dominated the land, the empire would encourage both to see the other as the primary threat. Xenophon would later describe this as the art of balancing Greeks against Greeks. It was not invention, it was policy. None of this developed in isolation. Envoys traveled. Rumors circulated. Merchants carried more than goods, they carried stories of tribute, policies, alliances, and grievances. Greek politics had never been centralized, but it had become interconnected, and interconnection is fertile soil for conflict. Where once cities fought over pasture land or disputed borders, they now fought over trade lanes, alliances, and ideological legitimacy. In that environment, the memory of Persia transformed. For Athens, Persia became a reference point, a defeated colossus that justified imperial stewardship. For Sparta, Persia became a reminder that discipline and conservatism were virtues, not hindrances. For Persia, Greece became a region best managed through financial influence rather than military aggression. For smaller polis, Persia became distant noise, the real threat was the city with ships or the city with spears just across the sea or mountain. But the most powerful transformation occurred in the minds of individuals. The veterans of Plataea aged into men who remembered a time when Greece confronted an external enemy and rose above itself. The young grew into a generation that looked at Athens and saw not a state defending freedom but a state defining it. To define freedom is to control it, and to control it is to invite resistance. Freedom, like empire, is a word that asks who is empowered to enforce it. Sparta claimed freedom was the right to be left alone. Athens claimed freedom was the right to lead. The difference between those definitions could have been resolved had both sides accepted a hierarchy. But neither city accepted subordination. The Persian Wars had been a war of necessity. The conflict that followed would be a war of principle. And principles are not negotiated. They are tested. When the Persians withdrew from Greece, it was easy to imagine that history had reached a conclusion. The enemy had been expelled, the cities had survived, and the temples would be rebuilt. For storytellers, that would have been a clean ending. But history rarely rewards clean endings. It prefers continuations, and the greatest continuation born from Plataea was not peace, but the question of which city would define Greece in the century to come. For almost 3 decades after the battle, the transformation unfolded slowly, as if the Greek world itself did not realize it was changing. The Delian League grew wealthier, more organized, and more centralized. Sparta remained powerful but reluctant, as if pulled between the demands of the present and the expectations of the past. Persia stabilized and waited. The smaller cities, sensing that the old balance of power was gone, adjusted their loyalties with the weather. What made the aftermath so profound was not the inevitability of conflict, but the subtlety of its arrival. The Peloponnesian War did not erupt because of a single insult or treaty violation. It arrived because the Persian Wars had taught Athens and Sparta different lessons about what leadership meant. Athens learned that power flowed from the sea, wealth, and participation. Sparta learned that power flowed from land, discipline, and restraint. Those philosophies were not merely military, they became political identities. When Corinth complained about Athenian interference in its trade routes, Sparta listened. When Megara was excluded from Athenian markets, Sparta reacted. When smaller island cities attempted to leave the Delian League and were punished, Sparta took note. None of these incidents alone justified war. Collectively, they painted a portrait of a Greek world no longer held together by common cause, but instead pulled apart by incompatible ambitions. The irony is that the Greeks never celebrated Plataea as the decisive victory it was. Thermopylae became legend. Marathon became myth. Salamis became drama. Plataea became memory, essential, decisive, bloody, and difficult. Perhaps that is why it faded from popular imagination. A beautiful defeat is easier to remember than an ugly victory. But it was the ugly victory that reshaped the map. Pausanias, whose name should have stood beside Leonidas and Themistocles, was erased instead, first by rumor, then by policy, and finally by starvation. His fate revealed something uncomfortable about the Greek world: it could honor sacrifice, but it had no mechanism to honor power without fearing it. Athens embraced power. Sparta distrusted it. Persia understood it. The Helots dreamed of it. And within that tangle of perspectives, Greece stood at the threshold of a century defined not by foreigners, but by itself. The wars between Athens and Sparta would not begin immediately. They required friction, decades of suspicion, and the gradual realization that two systems could not dominate the same region without coming into collision. When the Peloponnesian War finally began, the Persian Empire did not march into Greece to exploit it. They funded both sides selectively, prolonging the conflict, ensuring that the victors emerged exhausted. In the end, Greece did what Persia could not. It dismantled its own unity. Not through defeat, but through success. The very qualities that allowed the Greeks to repel empire, their stubborn independence, their civic pride, their obsession with autonomy, made it impossible for them to share leadership once the threat had vanished. And this is the hidden legacy of Plataea. It did not simply end the Persian invasion. It made possible the rise of Athens, the rivalry with Sparta, the flowering of democracy, philosophy, architecture, and art. And eventually the self-inflicted war that weakened the Greek world enough for Macedon to conquer it. Victory is never the end of a story. It is the beginning of another. If we return to that plain in Boeotia, to the dust-soaked armor, the shattered wicker shields, and the fallen horse of Mardonius, we can see the hinge of history turning. 10,000 Spartans and their allies did not merely defeat the Persian army, they altered the direction of the West. It was at Plataea, not Thermopylae, where the idea of a free Greek world survived long enough to shape the centuries that followed. Thermopylae gave Greece a martyr. Plataea gave Greece a future. And yet futures are fragile. They require choices as much as victories. After Plataea, the Greeks chose politics over unity. They chose influence over cooperation. They chose ambition over gratitude. In doing so, they proved something about humanity that remains true across every age. The greatest challenges are rarely the enemies who invade, but the decisions that follow once they are gone. The Persian Wars began as a catastrophe. They ended as a paradox. A continent was saved, but a world was divided. A hero was created, and then destroyed. A coalition fought to defend freedom, and then learned that freedom does not guarantee harmony. Plataea was not the end of conflict, it was the end of illusion. If you made it this far into the story, you're the kind of person who keeps history alive. Tell me in the comments, if you lived in that world, would you have chosen the discipline of Sparta, the ambition of Athens, or the patience of Persia? And if you want more forgotten battles, lost leaders, and turning points like this, make sure to like the video, subscribe, and let me know where in the world you're watching from. History feels different when we explore it together.